First, thanks very much to Ian and to Simon Fraser for inviting me here. It's always wonderful to come back to Vancouver. I taught here from 81 to 84, which was a very tumultuous time, and I taught in probably the best department I've ever taught in, the history department at Simon Fraser at that time, which was a wonderful department. One of my old colleagues and friends, Al Seeger, is here, and there are others associated with the department here as well. I want to start by saying that the title for this talk, The Audacity of Hope, 1968, Then and Now, I actually had not even registered that this was Barack Obama's, the title of his book. When I had thought that this was the title of a Raymond Williams book, but the real title of Raymond Williams' book was Resources of Hope. And that was more what I was keying on, and in some senses what I'll be keying on today when I talk, although I won't mention much about Williams's book. So it really wasn't a cribbing of Obama's title. And I would argue, and I might run into challenges from some, that, am I okay with this? Can people hear me? Yeah. I think so. I don't think yeah. I would argue that the project of 68, and as Ian said, we're talking more about a date, we're talking about a kind of happening and a phenomenon, that there was more hope and there was more audacity in that than there was in Obama's project, which in some senses ended up to be a fairly limited project, a very important one, particularly in the symbolism of a black president, but beyond that, the politics, not so much. And I should say that as the first speaker as well today, I thought I would err on the side of introducing Canada's 1968 rather broadly, covering a lot of ground that others will touch on in more particular instances subsequently. And this also allows me to leave the conceptual sophistication for other speakers who follow. Like Ian and my old friend Jerry Zaslow. Is Jerry here yet? No. He will be here. Anyway, these people are far more capable of branching out conceptually than I am, so I'm happy to leave that to them. And given that we've had personal histories introduced, I actually had wanted to start with a couple of points on that as well, although I won't get into grandfathers and family history. But I will say that born in 1951, I was 17 in 1968. And I was therefore not old enough to have played any influential role in the new left that I'll be talking about. But I was old enough to be stamped and influenced by the politics of dissent and the effervescent cultural and intellectual climate of this formative period. And I also, a second point that I'd like to make, and looking around the room, most of you will understand this. I was also part of a lucky generation in many ways. To come of age in the 60s was to have benefited from the post-World War II climate of capitalism's probably only high water mark. Of the 20th century. The arrival and the brief and incomplete and inadequate consolidation of the welfare state, the expansion of higher education, the seeming breakdown of conventional constraints associated with class and gender, certainly, and even race to some extent. These were all features of that moment of the 60s. They were, of course, transitory, and what capitalism gave, in some senses, it could take back, which it did, relatively quickly as the mid-1970s ushered into being a kind of a new crisis of widening dimensions in the sphere of accumulation, a politics of neoliberal restraint, which in some senses wrote fini to the sensibility that anything was possible, a defining feature, I would think, of 1968's audacities. So my generation was born really under the fortunate post-war enthusiasms of possibility that freed many of us from the anxieties and worry over material life that curbs hope and that chokes off appreciations that resistance is not only necessary, but actually the belief that it is possible, the expansive belief that it is possible. I think any of us who have children have been confronted with this, with their saying, that was okay for you. You could do that, but we can't. And I both accept that, but challenge it to some extent, in the sense that I do believe in subjectivities that are willing to sort of break out of molds of constraint. But the context really then that was that in the 60s was very different than now. It was an explosive period of polarizations associated in some senses with an old order's last gasp. And Ian touched on some of this. Imperialist and Cold War continuities lived on into the 60s, threatening the stockpiling of nuclear arms on the part of the Soviet Union and the United States. In Vietnam, of course, where American aggression and atrocity and Canadian complicity were by the mid to late 1960s increasingly on display. Protests ensued. A racial politics of oppressive structural confinement, which had long been foundational to both the United States and Canadian civil societies, cracked in public mobilizations of indigenous peoples and African Americans as bridge blockades, occupations, and ghetto riots and rebellions erupted. Women, long suppressed by patriarchy, demanded rights to their bodies and to an equal place in society. And workers, and this is less well talked about, especially young workers, were also in upheaval. Although this is far less commented on in the conventional writing on 1968, which is seen as a youth and student protest largely. But a youthful labor force could well have been in danger of lapsing into complacency because of the victories achieved in a post-war settlement that recognized collective bargaining rights. That impressive achievement was secured through a quid pro quo that granted the trade unions entitlements in exchange for organized labor's commitment to live by the contractual rules. By the mid-1960s, however, many young workers were not of a mind to abide by these rules if they thought they were constraining them, and they often were. They shared little of the Cold War anti-communism of their social democratic trade union leaders, and they erupted in wildcat strikes in the 1964-1966 years that assailed bosses, employers, and ensconced and often conservative trade union bureaucracies. Universities, of course, in this time period seized with protests and conflicts from Simon Fraser to Concordia. Now, not everyone born in the aftermath of World War II was a part of all of this, but many of us were, and enough to mark the era of '68 as one of radical alternative. Now, that radicalism was unleashed with a profound sense of hope. We were an audacious generation, and this is a bit nostalgic, demanding much, and I would argue at our best, not inclined to settle for too little. In the end, we failed to transform our society as we had wanted to, but in the struggle to do so, many of us forged our better selves. Now, a longtime revolutionary whom I've spent decades researching and writing about, James P. Cannon, said in a celebration of his 60th birthday, "Youth is the age of wisdom," he said, "when our ideals seem to be, as they really are, more important than anything else in the world. Youth is the age of virtue, or more correctly, the age of courage, which is the first virtue. Every man's younger self," and he was speaking in a gendered language, "is his better self." Now, Cannon's words would not be accepted, I think, by many today. Youth is not necessarily or generally understood like this. For not all youth, indeed, do embrace courage, virtue, and a commitment to radical social change. But one's social conscience, I would argue, if it is developed, is generally done in one's youth. It generally traces back to that. Now, there are people who come very late in age to monumental shifts in consciousness and perspective, but for the most part, I would say our better selves are forged in the promise of our youth and the beliefs and commitments of that period. And the youthful rebels of 1968 were, in my view, our generation's better selves. They refused the acquisitive individualism that capitalism nurtures incessantly. They embraced the collective understandings of social betterment. They saw the future as not just open to boundless change, but dependent on that transformation if it was to be a future for all of humanity, and not just a future benefiting the select few. The rebels of '68 had the audacity to think that meaningful change, while it needed to be struggled for, was in fact realizable and possible. And their hope was always inclusive and expansive. Even when it faltered, it was inclusive and expansive, rather than exclusive and singular. The audacity of hope, which nurtured anti-capitalist sensibilities in this period, was ironically cultivated, as I've suggested earlier, within capitalism's so-called golden age. Jobs seemed plentiful. Capitalist crises manifested in depressions and recessions seemed less acute than those experienced by, for instance, the generation of the 30s. A new left, reared on this largesse, had the temerity to think that things could be better, and they had the audacity to think that problems could be overcome and the deficiencies of an old left transcended. And this was a good part of the euphoria of the moment. The new communist movements of the 70s that grew out of these new left articulations, Maoist and Trotskyist, were the result. We now know, however, that the hopes of '68 and the hopes of these new communist movements were in retreat no less than a decade later. In the throes of disillusion, youthful commitments sometimes atrophied, and some of the new left abandoned their better selves to cultivate the politics of accommodation. But many remained committed and hopeful. Winnipeg Saigonik, editor of Canadian Dimension, which was arguably one of the longest published magazines of the New Left in the history of the New Left globally, wrote on the 20th anniversary of 1968, "We were brazen and brave and we shook them badly despite our mistakes. We'll do it again." Perhaps not overly nostalgic, but the commitment was there. In any reflection on 1968 then and its meaning today, we really have to grasp first, and Ian touched on this again, he's stolen a lot of my push here. We have to really grasp how what happened and what came out of 60s really anticipated much that would later come to pass. And I'll just do a couple of sort of weird instances of this. Consider, for instance, the end of history triumphalism that writers on the right and center left made so much of with the fall of the Soviet Union. Francis Fukuyama's, statement that really liberal, democratic, capitalist forms of government would be the sort of really the only politics. That looks a bit strange now, given what's happening in Brazil and elsewhere, that liberal democratic governments were heralded as the answer, and not only the answer, but as the ultimate victor. The New Left argued that both the Soviet Union and the United States, as bureaucratic societies curbing democratic initiative and the movement of progress, had actually stopped history in its tracks. The first phrasing that I could find of an end of history comes from Mario Sovo's, a speech by Mario Sovo, the Berkeley free speech advocate, in 1968. "The most exciting things going on in America today are movements to change America," he said. "The futures and careers for which American students now prepare are for the most part intellectual and moral wastelands. The chrome-plated consumer's paradise would have us grow up to be well-behaved children, but an important minority of men and women coming to the front today have shown that they would die rather than be standardized, replaceable, and irrelevant. Here is the real contradiction," he said. "The bureaucrats hold history as ended." As a result, significant parts of the population on campus and off are dispossessed, and these dispossessed are not about to accept this ahistorical point of view. Savio focused on automation, alienation, and segregation as the social problems his generation confronted, and the 68ers addressed them in new ways. In Canada, the newness of this new left was evident from the very beginnings of the movement. Born underneath the cloud of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, chilled by the deforming iciness of the Cold War, Canada's New Left distanced itself from centralized, undemocratic decision-making, which it claimed was inexorably related to the growth of the welfare state, the sort of benefits that had come into the post-war settlement. This New Left was able to see as part of the sort of really incarceration of the political spirit. Electoral politics was often conceived as a dead end. Despite all our glorification of democracy in Canada, the real centers of power remain far out of reach for the electors and remain intact and totally undisturbed by elections, no matter who is elected, wrote one New Leftist. Radical activities within university departments and classrooms, spreading to and growing out of communes, high schools, daycare centers, and community organizations were all understood to be stepping stones towards a larger revolutionary movement yet to be constituted. A major figure in the Western Canadian New Left, James Harding, held to the preeminent importance of, quote, confrontation with the authoritarian bureaucracies. Sounding very much like Savio, Harding often put forward views remarkably similar to those in the Port Huron Statement, although he might also understate the connection to the U.S., insisting that Students for a Democratic Society, for instance, had far more of an influence in Ontario than it did in other regions of Canada. This is part of the sort of regionalization of Canada, which is a central sort of component of Canadian identity in many ways. By 1969, and here I'm coming to another point where the New Left sort of anticipated future conceptual understandings. By 1969, Harding had cast off the net of New Left, had cast the net of New Left activism very widely. An extra parliamentary opposition, he wrote, will have to struggle against liberal democratic bureaucracies at all levels of society, on campus, in trade unions, in all the institutions of the corporate world. This strategy must be explicit because the institutions of neo-capitalism are all-encompassing, and radical politics cannot be abstracted from the people, as, for example, in the case with party politics or any form of bureaucratic politics. Our struggle, he concluded, must be at the base of society where the people are, not among the elites and those who yearn to become part of elites. This means ultimately organizing in mental hospitals, prisons, offices, and the military, in addition to schools and to factories. And this was, of course, very much the message of Foucault at a particular juncture in his writing. So a lot was anticipated there. Within the New Left segments drawn to anarchism, the assault on bureaucratic manipulation, the proclaimed virtues of civil disobedience, the embrace of the boldest concepts of a realizable utopia were perhaps most pronounced. And this was then a struggle against Puritanism, against consumerism, against obedience to authority, and it was well developed by people such as Dimitri Rizopoulos, who founded Our Generation magazine in the 60s. Resistance then was always audacious in its insistence that liberation was understood to be wide-ranging, incapable of being collapsed into narrow containers. Herbert Marcuse, an esteemed New Left theoretician, framed the radical project in philosophical terms in his essay on liberation, published in 1969. The new sensibility, he wrote, emerges in the struggle against violence and exploitation, where this struggle is waged for essentially new ways and forms of life. The negation of the entire establishment, its morality, its culture, the affirmation of the right to build a society in which the abolition of property and toil terminates in a universe where the sensuous, the playful, the calm, and the beautiful become forms of existence and thereby the form of society itself. In the audacity of hoping for a thoroughgoing realization of radicalism, 1968 promised the possibility then of social transformation culminating in freedom, both individual and collective. Marcuse continued, if now in the rebellion of the young intelligentsia, the right and the truth of the imagination become the demands of political action, if surrealist forms of protest and refusal spread throughout the movement, this apparently insignificant development may indicate a fundamental change in our situation. The political action which insists on a new morality and a new sensibility as preconditions and results of social change occurs at a point at which the repressive rationality that has brought about the achievements of industrial society becomes utterly regressive, rational only in the efficiency to contain liberation. Now, this thinking had animated, for instance, the Students for Democratic Society in its manifesto, the Port Huron Statement, in 1962, declaring a new left must start controversy across the land if national policies and national apathy are to be reversed. If we appear to seek the unattainable, as has been said, then let it be known that we do so to avoid the unimaginable. And part of that was, of course, the critique of the nuclear arms buildup and the threat of sort of nuclear holocaust. Seeking the unattainable, on lower levels perhaps, was a feature of Canada's 1968, whether the demands be structured by indigenous peoples' refusals of colonialism, the mobilizations for McGill Française and an end to racism that animated student protests in Montreal, or the revolutionary embrace of a national independence that ended class exploitation, which after all was really what the FLQ was all about until it spiraled downward in October of 1970 with the tragic turn towards terrorism and the sort of killing of Cross and the killing of Laporte and the kidnapping of Laporte and Cross. The Student Union for Peace Action, which was the Canadian student movement's, kind of initial push of the mid-1960s, reflected this audacious activism. They opposed Canada's role in the nuclear arms race. They worked on Aboriginal reserves to do what could be done to lift what Harold Cardinal would later refer to as the buckskin curtain, which was a lowering of racist indifference by the Canadians to state and society over the distressing conditions Indigenous peoples lived within. They advocated for the poor in working-class, town-gown divided cities like Kingston. They confronted racism in Halifax's Africville, and they struggled for student syndicalism on university campuses and lived among Doukhobor communities in British Columbia in order to learn about traditions of pacifism and the rejection of capitalist materialism. SUPA was pretty much dead and buried by 1968, but the young rebels who led and joined the Canadian student movement under its auspices were the shock troops of 1968 north of the 49th parallel. They rallied around the anti-Vietnam War standard. They organized teach-ins. They aided American draft dodgers in their escape to Canada. They gravitated to increasingly Marxist-influenced bodies like the Toronto Student Movement and the New Left Caucus. And they authored one of the first 1960s feminist manifestos in the English-speaking world, Judy Bernstein, Myrna Woods, Peggy Morton's, and Linda Caesar's 1967 founding document of the Toronto Women's Liberation Movement, Sisters, Brothers, Lovers, Listen. Indeed, when the full history of 1968 in Canada is written, an important chapter will recognize the pioneering role Canadian women played in audaciously articulating the politics of feminism. If the SUPA Women's Manifesto was one component of this, equally important was Maggie Benston's contribution, a 14-page article that reverberated around the world, The Political Economy of Women's Liberation, which was first published in Monthly Review in 1969, but had circulated for 2 years in a samizdat-like version. Italian women, a segment of the Italian women's movement referred to themselves as Bensonitas. So the struggle for modern women's liberation was forged on this anvil of 1968's audacious hopes. And so too were anti-racist mobilizations, which had a long history in Canada, but took on new urgencies in the rebellious climate of the 1960s. In Montreal, at Sir George Williams University, for instance, protests almost cracked the college's bank. The trashing and torching of a room where the computers, tapes, and punch cards were kept, the damages reporting to reach 2 to 5 million in some reports. The arrests, almost 100, among them a future senator of Canada, Ann Cools, and a future prime minister of Dominica, Rosie Douglas. Angered by a professor's racist treatment of black students, grievances had long been lodged with various university authorities and bodies as early as April of 1968, but they were largely swept under bureaucratic rugs And a January 1969 hearing, which promised more prevarications, was taken over by 200 rowdy students. They later occupied the computer center, and when police were sent in weeks later, the university property was trashed and torched. Kennedy Frederick, a Grenadian leader of the protests, endured a 25-day criminal hearing in which he was held without bail, transported to court in a cage-like vehicle, his hands shackled behind his back. He was charged with 12 counts of conspiracy, arson, and damage to and prevention of the lawful use of property. He was later exonerated for lack of proof. All the charges basically fell by the wayside. But across Canada, and this will be familiar in these times, the media denounced the, quote, gang of hooligans, rampaging criminals, anarchists, and thugs who had protested racism at Sir George Williams. In Ottawa, federal politicians pointed the finger of blame at Caribbean students and the supposedly lax immigration laws that allowed them access to Canadian higher education. They were soon demanding that more restrictive practices govern the entry of foreigners to Canadian universities. This was the climate that produced Rolf Frederick's poem Man Trap, which both articulated black student anger and harkened back to stanzas of Allen Ginsberg's late 50s beat epic Howl. They designate institutions, we disintegrate the infernos. They consummate animals that abort us, nursing grounds for dysgenic beasts, developing ghettos, social workers, to create Negroes. Man Trap, I know your name, your face. Now, at McGill, the man trap was not so easily identified racially, but rather more in terms of nationality and class. Stan Gray led a 15,000-strong protest march in 1969, the chants outside the gates of the Anglophone University reverberating across Quebec's historic distinctiveness. McGill Française, McGill au Québécois, McGill au Travailleur. Again, we forget the class content of this moment so often. The extent to which the FLQ was about working class liberation as well as national liberation, the extent to which the McGill Française movement was about McGill au Travailleur. Police barricaded the university, helicopters hovered above, and a small contingent of Tory students mocked the rebellious throng, breaking into a chorus of God Save the Queen. Now, Gray was fired from his teaching post, a hard lesson in how the audacity of hope and longing for social transformation could be costly pursuits in these years. But he was soon agitating again on other fronts, building on extra-parliamentary opposition, creating the Front de Libération Populaire, playing a prominent role in the establishment of a Quebec Committee for Solidarity with the Black Panthers. And in October of 1970, of course, Gray would be swept up in the state's Post-War Measures Act repression, part of a Black Friday arrest of 500 dissidents, very few of whom were actually connected to the FLQ, whose underground cells had, as I said, kidnapped Cross and Laporte. Now, Simon Fraser, and I had to say a few words about Simon Fraser, was, of course, an explosive indication of the pan-Canadian student revolt that rocked campuses from Halifax to Victoria. Libraries were locked down, buildings were occupied, faculty clubs were invaded by gas mask-wearing students who sometimes unleashed squealing pigs amid cries of "thought police, thought police." Classes were boycotted, department chairs barricaded in their offices, curriculums changed, and victimized Marxist professors defended. SFU saw a long-standing battle erupt that involved not only radical students and teaching assistants, but new left Marxist faculty and some committed liberal colleagues. The class power of the university was at the center of the controversy. The radicals had the audacity to demand open admission for working-class students, again, a class dimension. Student researchers uncovered the not terribly well-hidden story of corporate capital's dominance at SFU, how its Senate was ruled by presidents and directors of major enterprises. Labor unions and native welfare tenant and teacher organizations, however, had nary a voice in the corridors of university power. Former SUPA activists Sharon Yandel and Jim Harding were among the most prominent of the shit disturbers when hundreds of students occupied the administration buildings in November 1968, rifling through files as they lunched on peanut butter sandwiches. They discovered that the RCMP had been compiling dossiers on 600 SFU students, including a number of American war resistors. After 4 days of this, the administration had had enough. It called in the police, the public address system announcing the party's over. Cries of police state echoed on Burnaby Mountain. During the course of the next summer, the experimental Red Center of SFU radicalism, the political science, sociology, and anthropology department, was attacked by the administration. The program's elected committee of students, staff, and faculty were unceremoniously disbanded by dictate from above. The department's chair was removed. The program was put under trusteeship, and a number of targeted rabble-rousing faculty were dispensed with, their contracts not renewed. A strike was declared for 24 September 1969. 6 weeks of confrontation ensued, supported by thousands of students, many of whom were arrested. Injunctions were obtained to stop the protests. The largely New Left Marxist faculty was locked out and subsequently purged. And SFU President Kenneth Strand could not countenance the bold and utopian exercise in critical thinking and radical democracy that his political science, sociology, and anthropology department had in fact pioneered. He told them bluntly, the society and the economy is capitalist, and the university serves that system. At SFU, Strand did what he could to bring 1968 to a halt. Now, my point is not that such actions, and here again we touch on the nostalgia, were always right and righteous. They weren't. In any final accounting and reckoning of what went on in 1968, there will have to be a critique of much that was done, much that was thought, and much that was argued for. That said, I have a different kind of stand today. It's the audacity and the struggle for an all-encompassing liberation that was, to me, the moment's finest contribution. And within that, I'm willing to accept mistakes and errors of enthusiasm and audacity. And I think any movement that seeks a social transformation will have to do precisely that and reckon with them. But from where we sit right now, it's the reckoning with that audacity and that hopefulness and that possibility of revolutionary transformation that I see as fundamental. Because we are a long way from that now. We are a long, long way from that now. The most decisive turn that's been taken against this audacity and this possibility has been economic. As capitalism's golden age crashed in the early to mid-1970s with the oil shock of 1973, a reminder of the limits of capital's unbridled reign of accumulation, politics followed the trajectory of the economy downward into a right-wing assault on all those whose post-World War II secure entitlements signaled the achievements won through a century and more of struggle. Foremost among the entitled were organized workers, and the state targeted first the public sector before moving on to a more generalized assault on all trade unions. If the labor movement could fight back, there were others, beneficiaries of an incompletely established welfare state, or those who faced the Canadian project of colonialism's particular acts of dispossession, who were less able, in some senses, to fight back, but who tried and struggled and mounted a resistance, Native peoples, the poor, the disabled. For labor, the signs of the new order were quickly apparent. Between 1975 and 1978, Canadian wages declined by 8%. By 1982, unemployment had soared to an official rate of 11%. Household savings were sacrificed, falling from 20% of family income in 1982 to 10% in 1994 to the dangerously low level of 2% by 2005. The combative trade union movement, whose struggles had been a backdrop to the youth revolt and the Audacity of Hope of 1968, seemed somewhat declawed. In 1995 to 97, the number of strikes, for instance, in Canada had dropped to no less than 300 annually, compared to a figure approaching 1,000 in the 1970s. In 2006, the total number of strikes across Canada plummeted to a meager 200. Momentous mobilizations of resistance did early in this process take place, especially in Quebec and notably in British Columbia. BC's Solidarity Mobilization, which many here would have lived through, I think, was a high water mark of class struggle in the province, and hundreds of thousands of protesters were brought into the streets to fight the draconian social credit restraint budget, which was a model of the new right's attack on labor, the poor, and a wide swath of minority constituencies. Understanding what happened in Solidarity's fight back is a contested minefield today. But for those on the non-aligned left, I would argue it was, in spite of its heroic oppositional groundswell, a denouement of defeat, the pall of which hung over this province for decades. In Ontario, a decade and a half after BC's Solidarity, the labor movement organized impressive days of action in the late 1990s to resist Mike Harris's conservative common sense revolution. Hundreds of thousands of people turned out in one-day work stoppages and days of political protest, outstripping the estimates of support within the Ontario Federation of Labor. Militant and echoing cries for a general strike that had animated many of BC Solidarity protests also occurred in Ontario. The resistance to Harris and the Tories looked like it was heading for a generalized showdown with teachers' strikes leading the way. But in the end, as in BC, the mobilization was rather abruptly terminated by Ontario Federation of Labor-affiliated trade union leaders. And a divide emerged between public sector CAW militants, their ranks in various social movements, and those unions tied more directly to the New Democratic Party. With the left eviscerated over the course of the 1980s, the powerful trade unions faced a determined opposition of employers and the state. Governments, both federal and provincial, offered a resurgent capital, an array of legislative curbs on trade union powers and entitlements. Job prospects for the young disappeared into the black hole of precarity and casualization. By the turn of the century, the audacity and hope of 1968 seemed long gone. Social movements still existed and arose seemingly spontaneously to protest globalization and a variety of other issues, but they tended to be particularistic in their approach to change, focused on specific constituencies, rather than broadening struggles to include wider and wider dimensions of advocacy. Where 1968 lived on was in pockets of determined resistance among Native peoples. I think Red Power, as a mobilization that sort of emerged in the 60s, really did continue decisively on into the 70s with park occupations, and into the 80s and 90s with Elijah Harper's actions in Parliament, with Oka, for instance, the tragic events at Ipperwash, where Dudley George was killed by Ontario Provincial Police, and has continued on into the current century, associated with figures like Tyanadaega's Sean Brandt, who has engaged in militant protests and critiques of some of the mainstream Native leadership. Feminism, too, survived, albeit in less socialistic forms that had been common in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Gay, lesbian, and transgendered struggles, which are very much to the forefront in our time, were barely on the radar screen, I would argue, of protests of the 60s. But they were intimately, I think, related to, in their eruptions in the 70s and 80s, to the sexual liberation kind of ethos of that moment of 68. Anti-war mobilizations remain, of course, but nothing like the protests associated with the Vietnam War have emerged of late, because in some ways the context in which imperialism and colonialism of 2018 operates is somewhat different than the more militarily interventionist imperialism of the Vietnam War era. The bifurcations of the Cold War period are now deeply complicated by the final collapse of what was once known as actually existing socialism, which has disintegrated into the camp of capitalist restoration, fully realized in Russia and threatening to unfold similarly in China, possibly even in places like Cuba. For those on the left, then, who want to reignite the fires of audacity and hope that burned so hot and brightly in the 1960s, the task is indeed a difficult one. But in its audacities and in its hopes, despite how difficult it is going to be, the broad moment of 1968, with its unflagging sense that fundamental and wide-ranging social transformation was indeed both possible and desperately needed, that remains with us still, a reminder that what is best in all of us is the idealism of our youth. Thank you.